There's things that set this case apart. The people involved in it have been to every court in New South Wales: local court, district court, Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, Coroner's Court. The other thing that sets this case apart is the secrecy that surrounds it. Non-publication orders, suppression orders, legal bars on what you can and can't say. This is the point where I start to lose friends, because I am a journalist, I like journalists, I'm friends with some journalists, but there's been misreporting because people didn't know the facts, and that's one thing. Like, most of the time as journalists, we're scratching around, trying to work out what the truth is and then telling our best version of it. But there's been misreporting that is, I'd hate to say deliberately slanted, but at least subconsciously slanted. And there's been stuff that I've seen reported, and then we've gone away and worked on it and come up with bunch of documents or spoken to various people, and I've looked at these original reports and gone, you just got that wrong.
The Eye Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to Eye Catch Killers. Welcome to another episode of Eye Catch Killers. Today, we're going to have a conversation I need to have. I'm going to talk about an investigation that has had a huge impact not only on my own life, but has devastated other lives. We're going to talk about the William Tyrrell investigation. I led that investigation for 4 years before I was removed from the investigation over 5 years ago, and I was criminally charged and convicted. Some people might say, who cares what I've got to say? Well, I've sat on the sidelines since that time and have witnessed misinformation and speculation flourish about the investigation. Everyone seems to have an opinion of what happened to William. I'm hoping the person I'm speaking to today will put a spotlight on the issues surrounding the William Tyrrell case with an in-depth podcast series called Witness William Tyrrell. Our guest is award-winning journalist Dan Box, who I have had the pleasure to work with on many occasions. I consider him a mate and respect his integrity. Hopefully, we'll still be friends after this podcast. If you listen, you'll understand where I'm coming from with that comment. Dan Box, welcome to Eye Catch Killers.
Thank you.
This is going to be, I think, an awkward conversation because of the subject matter.
Look, it's going to be a sad conversation in places because of the subject matter, and it's going to be an angry conversation. I think probably for you, definitely, and maybe for me in places as well because of the subject matter. And it's going to be awkward. Yeah. You've been a crime reporter for a very long time. Yeah.
Have you been involved in reporting on or investigating a matter such as William Tyrrell that evokes so much emotion, polarises people, and have you seen anything like this in your time?
No, and I was thinking about exactly this on the walk here today. There's things that set this case apart. And it's not just the fact that it's a child at the centre of it, because I've worked on cases like you have that have had children at the centre of them. And it's not just the emotions. But what it is, I think, is two things, for me at least. One is the sheer scale of this case and the work that we've done on it. So we've been on this for 2 years, working on this podcast series. This case, or the people involved in it, have been to every court in New South Wales: local court, district court, Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, Coroner's Court. So we've got court files and documents, an incredible amount of information. We've 4 different coronial cases we've looked at as part of the research into this case, and it will be a 5th. But I think to get access to that, we're going to have to probably challenge a suppression order. And that's the other thing that sets this case apart, is the secrecy that surrounds it. I have never worked on any criminal investigation as a reporter that has been shrouded in this amount of secrecy. Non-publication orders, suppression orders, legal bars on what you can and can't say. And maybe because of all that secrecy, the amount of speculation and the amount of misinformation and the way people, including the media, have split into, frankly, two camps. You're either for William's foster mum or you're against her. I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, well, I think you've summed it up nicely, the type of intensity that surrounds it. But the way it polarises people, and I've been sitting on the sideline for 5.5 years, almost 6 years now, watching it. And what concerns me, all the opinions don't seem to be fact-based. It's an emotional investigation. People are very strong one way or the other, but they don't look at the facts. And coming from a homicide detective's point of view, now myself moving into the media, I thought stories would be driven by facts, but they don't seem to be.
You're talking about the public response here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, a good example of that is the stuff that people are saying about us online. Like, I've been abused, which is fair enough. Yeah. Maybe I deserve it. The people I work with have been abused.
When you're talking this is the people you're working on the podcast with.
Yeah. Called, horrendous things. Yeah. And I went into this with my eyes open. I knew there was going to be a bit of abuse. But to say the things they have and about the people I work with and about the fact that you and I have got a professional relationship that goes back a long time now. Even just this weekend, people are, I don't go looking for it, but sometimes it finds you. People are saying things, but they're not saying things because they know the facts. They're not saying things because, frankly, they've got a legitimate opinion that they'd be happy to say in the same room if they were sitting here. They're saying things because they think we disagree with them.
Yeah.
And so people are just throwing these kind of angry online abuse at us because it has split into these two different camps. Yeah. And you're right, like a factual understanding of what happened. In terms of the public response, sadly, that seems to be more than some people can deal with.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't hold me well when I'm now working in the media, but I hold the media partly responsible for it because I think I've been in the media long enough now to understand that what a story should be based on. And there's some stories that I've read, whether it be in print media or on audio or television, that is clearly misleading and all the facts haven't been presented. If you take one point in isolation and put that out as a story without giving it balance, of course it's going to evoke people's reactions.
Yeah, and this is the point where I start to lose friends because I am a journalist, I like journalists, I'm friends with some journalists, but I think you're right. There's been misreporting because people didn't know the facts, and that's one thing. Most of the time as journalists, we're scratching around, trying to work out what the truth is and then telling our best version of it. But there's been misreporting that is, I'd hate to say deliberately slanted, but at least subconsciously slanted. And there's been stuff that I've seen reported, and then we've gone away and worked on it and come up with a bunch of documents or spoken to various people. And I've looked at these original reports and gone, you just got that wrong. But I go back to the fact that this case was shrouded in secrecy from the start. So William Tyrrell is a foster child. And for, I think, years, we couldn't say that. You in the police knew he was. We in the media knew he was. Bunch of people online were saying he was. But the laws prevented us from saying it. So there's a secrecy right from the start that has been compounded and made more secret by all these different court orders restricting what you can say. And so as a result, people in the media have got some facts, and a lot of them are doing a really good job. But when you've got basically an absence of truth, an absence of facts, mistruths start to creep in to fill the void.
Yeah, well, I can say it's been frustrating for me sitting on the sidelines watching it. For the people involved, directly involved in the investigation, I talk the biological parents, the foster parents. I can only imagine what they're going through with the information. But let's just wind it back. The genesis of the podcast. Now, people know, and I'm glad you mentioned it. I mentioned it in the introduction. We've got a relationship. It's been a professional relationship from when you were a crime reporter and I was in the police. We've since worked together, and I think it's fair enough. And don't correct me here because it could be embarrassing. I think you could call us friends.
Yeah.
At this stage,
yeah.
Well, depending on what happens here in the podcast. It was always my intent when I found myself out of the police and working in the podcast space to do a podcast on William Tyrrell, because I wanted to set the record straight. And it's not about defending my position, it's just let's get all the facts out. I made a conscious decision that I think it would have been better for me to step away from doing a podcast because I'm too heavily invested in it, emotionally, professionally, and everything else. And I think it could look like it's self-serving if it's just a narrative I'm putting out. You come along. You're going to do a podcast. And I said, well, I don't want to be involved in it. I'll come in as a guest. And you cautioned me that you're not going to slant the podcast in my favour. You're going to do a deep dive into the investigation. And wherever that goes, so be it.
Yeah.
I accept that. And I've got to say here, and you can respond if you want, I was happy that you're doing it because I know the depth of investigative journalism that you do and your ethical approach to things. What's your take on the podcast? Why did you feel the need to do the podcast in the first place about William Tyrrell?
Yeah, look, so just on that question, and then going back to what you were saying about how the two of us do have this pre-existing relationship, because I've got to be frank about that as well. The thing with the podcast, and the reason I like working with them, there's two things. One is they're massive. So this thing is the series we're right in the middle of making at the moment. So I'm going to walk out here and I'm going to script one of the episodes. So we're right in the heart of it now. That's probably going to run to maybe 11 episodes, maybe 12 episodes. It's going to be running until the end of the year. Each of those, let's say, is 45 minutes long. Like, I can't even do the maths in my head, but that is hours and hours and hours of documentary reporting. There isn't a medium available today that gives you that much time. You look at Four Corners. We're going to do the equivalent of multiple episodes of Four Corners. We're going to do the equivalent of probably something like 60 to 70,000 words of script. That would be like an entire newspaper, maybe 2 days worth of a newspaper. So we're going to get into detail. We're going to be able to interrogate those facts that have maybe been misunderstood or misreported. We're going to be able to challenge different people's accounts and just give a better understanding of this thing, which isn't really that well understood because a podcast series is so big. So that's one of the reasons to do it. And the other reason, and this goes back to something you and I have worked together on, is a podcast lets you hear people tell their story in their own words. So you can hear the most honest version. And I'm not just talking about telling the truth honest, but emotionally honest. So you can hear the catch in their throat as they're trying not to cry when they're talking to you. You can hear that kind of pause when they're almost trying to process just the fact that they're dealing with, in this case, the loss of a 3-year-old boy. And that is a better way of telling this story than I can do on my own. Like, I can write stuff down and it might be in a newspaper, but it's never going to be as powerful or as honest emotionally as having the people who are at the center of this story tell that story in their own words. But to go back to you and I, because you and I first met and first ended up working on something that became another podcast, which was the Bowraville murders. Murder of 3 children up in a little town called Bowraville in the mid-north coast. And I remember at the time, like, I didn't know you from Adam, you didn't know me. You were a cop, I was a journalist, but you were working on that case and had been for 20 odd years. I came in and said, look, let's try doing a podcast about it. And I remember you saying, I can't remember if you said, what's a podcast? But you weren't impressed. Like, you'd never really heard of one.
In fairness, and you're quite right. That was a great statement. I think I did say, What do you mean a podcast? What's a podcast?
Yeah.
But that was one of the very early true crime podcasts.
Yeah, but it worked.
Yeah.
It told that story well. And at the same time, you guys in the police were calling for the alleged suspect to be sent back to court. The families were doing the same thing, and then we came along, and at the same time, and we created enough of a noise, and he ended up getting sent back to court, and that was a good result. But it does flag, that was best part of a decade ago now. So you and I have known each other for that long. We worked in as much as I was a reporter on that case, and then I've reported on other cases you worked on. Not because you do some interesting work, but also that was my job. I was a crime reporter, and you were working on high-profile cases. But then you left the cops. You and I co-wrote a couple of books, which were memoirs.
Yep.
So you talking about your career. And then I came back to Australia and ended up working for News Corp in podcasting, including overseeing the podcast that we're talking on now. So you and I have a professional relationship and a personal relationship that goes back a long time. So you talked about, with this William Tyrrell podcast, wanting to step back. And probably the thing I've got to say, and I will say in the podcast, is, Gary and I have got a long and established relationship. That doesn't mean I always agree with you on everything, and I don't, and I've told you that. But people listening to this today and to the William Tyrrell podcast, if they do, are going to have to judge for themselves if I can still be objective about you and your actions and what I think you got right and what I think you got wrong, even though you and I do know each other well.
Yeah. And I think it's important we get it out in this forum, talking about your podcast series, that people understand we're not hiding the fact. I don't want people to come out and go, oh, yeah, but Dan and Jubilan know each other and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's not a secret.
But, just to reassure people, because they're trusting us on what we're saying here, I got respect for you as a crime journalist, and I think I've said this to you, but in case people haven't heard this story, it was over an investigation. I forget which investigation I was working on, but you were doing an article where there was going to be some criticism of the police in an investigation, and you pulled me aside at the court. We're at court, and you said, can we just catch up for a sec? I just want to tell you something. And you said to me, look, I don't know, this is an awkward conversation, but I'm going to be reporting on something. I'm going to be critical of an investigation you were involved in or leading or whatever. And I think my response was I laughed. And I laughed at, well, that's your job, Dan. Like, I had respect for you, that the fact that you would report unbiasedly, regardless of whether we were forming a friendship or you knew me. And I respect journalism like that. So that's where I'm comfortable in what you're doing on the Tyrrell investigation. And I've always said with the Tyrrell investigation, bring on an inquiry. I invite your scrutiny in the William Tyrrell podcast. I've deliberately not got involved. We're deliberately...
Well, you, as much as we do interview you, but you're not involved in telling the story.
No, you interviewed me, and I think you apologised before we walked into this very room. You said you mightn't like me after this, and with the stuff that you put to me. But from my position, and I challenge everyone for this, that unless you ask the hard questions, I can't justify my position. So I didn't want it brushed over, and I'm confident with the podcast you're going to do that. The other thing about the Witness William Tyrrell podcast, I've seen how hard you've worked on it. And I haven't stuck my nose in and go, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? And I'm only listening to the podcast episodes when they come out and available to the public, because I don't want to be involved, because I don't want criticism saying, oh, Jubilan's had his hands over this. So where it falls, it falls. And I think, when I'm talking from a police point of view, when you've been handed the responsibility of investigating the disappearance of a 3-year-old child, you should be accountable, you should be responsible, and if you've made mistakes, they should be acknowledged and learnt from. So that's my position. So I think we can still be friends.
Oh, so far.
So far.
But you actually, we actually haven't done the episodes about you yet.
Jesus. Okay, cut. No, look, Dan, I invite it. It needs to be scrutinised. It's too important.
Yeah, look, I'm with you 100%. I think these things do need to be scrutinised, and I think this case, and particularly the fallout from the investigation, so 10 years, William's been missing, we still, in terms of the public, still have no idea what happened to him. Maybe the police do. But if they do, they haven't charged anyone. I think that does deserve scrutiny, because it's like a collective responsibility to say what happened here and did we get the response right, if only to stop it happening again, or help stop it happening again. That said, it's going to be uncomfortable. Like I joked before that I'm going to lose friends over this, but I will. I've been aware of that for a while, because any account of the investigation into William Till's disappearance is going to involve saying that some things weren't done well. And some things weren't done well by the police, and some things weren't done well by the media, and some things weren't done well by the state government, particularly the foster care authorities. And I know people in all of those groups, and like already there's one person who I thought we had a really good professional relationship with who is no longer responding to text messages. And that's fair enough.
Yeah.
You know, people get to make their own judgments, but I don't really have any choice. Like, I'm committed to doing this the best way I know how, which won't be perfect. And I'll make mistakes, and people have already spotted a couple and pointed them out, and we've corrected them. But if I'm going to do this the best way I know how, then it is going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I won't say take a stand, that's not the right thing, but to look at something in depth, objectively, there is always going to be collateral damage. That's the nature of what you do. Hedley Thomas, Teacher's Pet, and I use that as a reference point, because I sit here comfortably saying if Teacher's Pet didn't occur, that the podcast series Teacher's Pet didn't occur, that investigation wouldn't have been solved. That created an environment where the investigation was solved. I think the landscape has changed greatly, and I know this from being a police officer for 34 years, that it was very insular in what came out in the police. You had your contacts in the media, and the senior police would be contacting briefing the media, and it was very controlled. Podcasting has turned that world upside down. Police can no longer control a narrative. I think with Teacher's Pet, police lost control of the narrative there, and look what it resulted in. One
thing that was interesting about Teacher's Pet, and I think I probably know this from maybe listening, because you interviewed Hedley on this podcast, and maybe he was talking about it then, but at the start when Hedley was working on that, the police weren't cooperating at all.
Yep.
Which is basically standard, and that's fair enough. They're running live homicide investigations. They got to control what's said and what's known to the best of their ability. So the police weren't cooperating with Hedley. But then you start putting the series out and things change, because people see they're under scrutiny. And that's where we are. So we're 3 episodes have been published so far. People now know they're under scrutiny, and people are coming forward. We're being contacted with tips constantly, which is part of the reason I'm so tired at the moment, because we're trying to make the podcast, but also investigate all this new stuff that's coming in. And Hedley was doing the same, but the big thing that changed with him was the police came on board.
Yeah.
So I remember Hedley saying he sat down and had lunch with the then police commissioner, Mick Fuller, and basically said, you guys aren't cooperating, and explained what he was doing and how he was doing it, and the relationship changed.
Yeah.
So where we are at the moment is the police aren't talking to us. And I've been in and I've sat down with different heads of their media operation, because people have left the job, and said, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and these are the people I want to talk to. And so far, they are saying nothing. But if we've got a common purpose, which I do think we have, which is to try and establish what was done right and wrong in the 10 years since William went missing, to hopefully stop it happening again, then the more we can talk to the police and the more they can at least engage with us, then I think the better everyone is. That said, we are being quite critical of them.
Well, and what I say in response to that, because I was part of the investigation, there's a responsibility that comes with investigating a 3-year-old child. And
Yeah.
it's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
And to step into that role, you need to accept the consequences of it. The police not cooperating on a podcast. I can understand that. I'll give a benefit of the doubt on certain aspects with policing. Sometimes there's stuff that you want to withhold. And we're always cautious not to overstep the mark. But we've got an investigation now, 10 years, and there's been misinformation. The public, the media, the police have gone off in all different directions. It's chaotic. I look from the sideline and I think I'm as confused as the rest of the public about what's going on. When I was involved in leading the investigation, part of my responsibility was to keep the public informed, make appeals for witnesses, and answer questions from the media. So there was no address misinformation, because there's a lot of rumours going around when I was running it. I haven't seen that for the past, and it's almost going on 6 years since I've been off this investigation.
Yeah.
I have not seen a senior police officer stand there and take open questions about the William Tyrrell investigation.
Look, and the reason they're giving us, so at the moment, every episode I write, I send the cops an email and say, this is basically what we're going to say.
Yep.
And every news story we write, because we're also writing news stories for news.com.au, every one of those we write to the cops and we say, this is what we're going to say. And every time they write back and say, we cannot comment because there's an ongoing inquest, which is right. And the inquest is going to have its next public hearing next month. But what they're not doing, and what I've asked them if they want to do pretty much every single time, is say, all right, let's have a conversation about what you're saying. So I'm happy to say to them, in this upcoming news story or this upcoming episode, I'm broadly going to say this, 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 and this. And there's no secrecy because it's all going to get made public when it's published. But it gives them an opportunity to tell me if I'm wrong. To say, well, actually, you've misunderstood that. You've got that fact wrong. So why don't you correct that? So at least the version that's going out to the public is more accurate. And to be honest, a big part of the reason I'm trying to talk to them is so that can happen. So we can get the misinformation corrected. And hopefully there's none in our reporting. But it would help if the police would engage on that. Just not for me, and maybe not for them, but both of us would like people's understanding of this case to be as accurate as possible. So if nothing else, I would have thought they'd want to engage with that. But the attitude at the moment is much more now, we're just not going to say anything.
I call it like a head in the sand approach, and it's interesting saying that, and this is my opinion, not yours. I'm bemused by the fact that we're not commenting because it's a matter before the coroner, but then they come out and say there's only one suspect, or the senior serving police officer, as in the commissioner, comes out and says there's only one suspect in this matter. And
well, that is true. So the line we get is, we're not going to comment because there's an ongoing inquest, but the lead detective, Detective Chief Inspector David Laidlaw, was on TV, admittedly a couple of years ago, but the inquest was still going, and he was asked, do you know who did this? And he basically says, yeah, we've got an idea who did this. And then, you're right, the then police commissioner, Mick Fuller, is interviewed, and he confirms the police have one person they're particularly looking at. And we know the police are speaking off the record to different newspapers about the same thing. So there is communication that's happening from the police about this case while the inquest is ongoing, when they choose to communicate. And it's not happening with us. And look, that's not sour grapes. They can do whatever they like. They're running the homicide investigation. That's a big, important job. But it's just different at different times and in different cases.
All right, and I just not check you on one thing, but just bring back one point. You're saying that you hope with the podcast that if there's failings in the investigation, they're identified, so correct that it doesn't happen again. 100%. But I think we all the different parties, and the people that hate you like you, the people that hate me like me, everyone, we all should. The whole focus should be on finding out what's happened to William Tyrrell.
Yeah.
And I think with a podcast, what you're doing, a factual podcast, it really opens the door, and it opens the door to laying the facts out so people fully understand it. Has to set up the best possibility of getting the result with the investigation.
Oh, look, this is one thing I say to people. So when I talk to people in my line of work as a reporter, and I had a conversation last week which has said exactly the same thing, you're often talking to people who are grieving a loss, and sometimes with an unsolved homicide, they're grieving a loss, and they're grieving the lack of answers. They just don't know what happened to their loved one. And I talk to them and I say, look, you might talk to me, we might do an interview, and probably nothing will change. And I've got to be honest like that. I don't have the ability to fix things as a journalist. All I can really do is say, this is the best version of events as I've got it, and hopefully point a spotlight to that. But it doesn't always make a difference.
But, you're right, but in my experience solving homicides, it's that 1%, that little thing that can get you across the line.
You were always interested in that. You were much more happy to talk to the media. And let's be honest, you weren't doing it out of the goodness of your heart. You were doing it because you saw the media as a tool
100%
to use to help you in what you were doing, which was trying to catch a killer. And probably I got used as a tool. In fact, definitely I got used as a tool. How we met was you asked the State Crime Command media officer to put you in touch with some journalists to talk about that Bowerville investigation, because you wanted some publicity around the case, probably because you worked on the basis that more publicity around the case meant more political pressure, meant more resources for your case. And I was one of the journalists who came in and went, well, definitely I'm going to report on that. So did kind of what you wanted. But I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing.
I don't. I look at it, and if you felt used, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't feel used.
Okay.
Like I think we both had to go into that again, with our eyes open. Like, definitely, I wasn't there to do your bidding.
No,
100% not, and I'm not now. But I could see there was a public interest in reporting on that case. You could see there was a public interest in having the media report on that case. And so it helped at that point that we had those conversations I'm talking about that aren't happening with the William Tyrrell investigation now.
And look, I don't know what the mindset is in policing, but as I learnt my career as a major crime detective and working with people that I respected, people that were experienced major crime investigators, that the media was a tool to use. It's in the tools of every other thing. You use forensic evidence, you make appeals to the media, you keep the public informed. It's a tool. And I'm not saying that in a disrespectful way or using, but every time that I spoke, and particularly on the William Tyrrell matter, I spoke in consultation with a forensic psychologist on what messaging to get out when I'm doing doing the media. I'm making specific appeals. So, yeah, I think it is an important role, but just bringing it back, what we're talking about here with podcasts is that police have lost control with podcasting because they don't have the narrative. It was normally the media organisations and whatever camp they were in, they could release information that way. What's happened, like with Hedley Thomas's Teacher's Pet, Bowerville, you went a little bit rogue. You're reporting on things that the police would make no comment on. It makes people scrutinise the investigation. And I can say from a ex-cop's point of view, scrutiny on an investigation is a good thing.
You know what? What you have to accept to do this job is you have to accept that you're an outsider and you're going to stay an outsider. So Hedley is from Queensland, was reporting on a murder case in New South Wales. So by dint of that, he's already a bit of an outsider. He's not relying on the New South Wales police every day to get his stories and his contacts. With this one, I've got to accept that if I do this podcast we're working on now about William Tyrrell, honestly, then maybe there's going to be people who don't want to talk to me afterwards. including maybe the New South Wales Police, because we are critical. And we're critical of the police investigation right from the beginning. I mean, right from day one. There's a lot that was done right, and there's some that was done wrong, and we're going to say that. But you got to accept that that means they're not going to help me out with stories in the future. Or there's always that possibility. I'm not saying they are that petty, but there's that possibility they're not going to want to talk to me.
Well, isn't that... aren't they being pathetic? It's
Well, no, that's kind of human nature, though, isn't it?
It's childish, Dan.
But the thing is, a lot of journalists don't necessarily make that same judgment. And I'm not pointing at anyone at the moment at all, but there are journalists out there who rely on politicians, rely on institutions like the cops to get their stories. And I've been there. I've got stories from politicians and I've got stories from police forces. And then when you find yourself working on a story that's a bit critical, you do find yourself thinking, oh, if I write this, I might not get that next drop of a story. But you have to accept that that is going to happen, and you have to be happy to be the outsider.
I see that, and I understand what you're saying. I just don't respect it. I don't respect the fact that police who are public servants feel like they've got control over what they'll release because it might reflect badly on them. They're there to serve the public.
But if they are using the media, and I'm not trying to pick a fight, but if they are using the media to further their investigations like you used to, then fine. But the thing is, like, all of this is done in the shadows, isn't it? Like, there's no official rules of engagement. Maybe the police have got a long book on media practices, but I'm sure it doesn't include the off-the-record briefings that I know happen because I've had them. And I'm sure it doesn't include, you know, the very frank exchanges of information when it suits the police. And I'd be amazed if it included the fact that the police can basically decide who they talk to because they think this journalist is more sympathetic than the other. And all of that's fine, that's their job. But as the journo, you have to accept the reality of all of that. And if you are going to do this, and you're going to do it honestly, it is going to mean possibly that people don't want to talk to you afterwards.
Well, I suppose for what it's worth, I respect the journalists that, I think, and the journalists I look up to, and I've now been in there long enough to understand who I'd like to, I won't say follow, but adopt the practices of the ones that have got the courage to report the truth. And I thought that's what journalism is all about. And in regards to police, like, what you're going to, because it doesn't reflect well on you, you're going to withhold that from the media. So,
but that's the problem with it all being done in the shadows, isn't it? Like, if it's all done informally through these bluntly fairly cosy relationships, then there's no way of knowing if the police are doing this engagement with the media because it's in the interest of the investigation, or they're doing it because it's in their own interests. And look, you got to be really honest. Particularly in New South Wales, and I do have some experience of this because I've been a crime reporter in New South Wales for a long time. The police and the media have a really cosy relationship. We're really tight, and the New South Wales police leaks like a sieve. And as a journalist, that's great, but it means they have the ability to leak like a sieve to certain journalists, and they get to choose who they do work with. Anyway, I'm definitely not complaining. I'm definitely not saying I'm bitter about it, but it is the reality of it, and it has affected this investigation into William Tyrrell's disappearance.
Okay. Well, look, I'm probably burning bridges for you as we keep talking.
I seem to be merrily burning them for myself.
Look, Dan, let me give you some advice. I've basically burned every bridge I've ever walked over.
And how's that gone for you?
Well, I keep moving forward because you can't go back. It's probably not the best practice.
So just one thing that is worth flagging on this whole thing about leaking to the press. You've been accused of that.
Oh, time and time again.
Yeah. And I've spoken to people in the course of making this podcast who have sworn blind to me that you've leaked X to Y as a detective. And it's been said in court. I've sat in court when people have been talking about how you leaked. No one ever actually asked you in court, but it's been said about you. I know from the limited dealings I had with you that you didn't leak to me because I tried to get you to leak. more than once, and I tried quite hard sometimes, and you didn't. But I'd be remiss if I didn't flag that people have accused you of the thing I'm accusing others of.
Of speculation here, and sometimes if you don't know the answer, you shouldn't ask the question. I learnt that. But I'm going to ask this question. Has anyone said directly I leaked, like a journalist said directly I leaked?
No. But there's a problem. Like journalists, it's kind of like an etiquette. We don't ask each other their sources. But as an example, sorry to interrupt, and we can talk about this all now because it's all come out and it's all been made public. In fact, the early... We can call him this because he's subsequently been found to be completely not guilty of anything to do with William's disappearance. But one of the first high-profile suspects in that case was a guy called Bill Spedding, who was a local washing machine repairman. And one of the things the police found when they raided his home and his business and searched his cars was a Spider-Man toy in his work van. And that was significant because William Tyrrell was wearing a Spider-Man suit at the time he went missing, or at least it was thought to be significant. Now, that subsequently came out in the papers, and I don't know how it got out. And people have speculated it was a deliberate leak from yourself.
Yeah.
I've seen that speculation. But the one thing I do know is I found out about that Spider-Man toy from talking to another cop who wasn't on the strike force, who wasn't even in homicide, because it was obviously just chatter around the police force. And he mentioned it to me over a coffee. And I tried to get you to confirm it. I can remember the conversation. We were actually up near Kendal on the mid-north coast where William went missing. And I'd been told this, and I tried to get you to confirm it so I could write it. And you asked me, please don't report that, because it was sensitive for the investigation. And as a result, I didn't report it, because the most important thing was that the investigation did its best job to try and find William. And if I was going to trip that up, then I didn't want a part of that. So all I do know is that when I have tried to get you to leak, and that's an example, you've actually refused to, and then said, if you think that's true, please don't report it. So,
well, thanks for saying that, Dan. And I just want to wind it back because, when I talk about at the start, we're talking about the rumours, speculation, the innuendos that flow with the Tyrrell investigation. I've been accused of so many things. And I say here, and this is going out to all the public that listen, it's going out to the police, it's going out to the journalists. I defy any journalist to put their hand up and say I leaked information to them, because I haven't leaked the information. And the fact that I wasn't going to get emotional or cranky during this podcast, but as we talked about, the William Tyrrell matter evokes that type of response. I ran that investigation for 4 years. There weren't leaks going when I was running the investigation.
Well, there were from someone.
On which issue?
So when Bill Spedding got arrested, there was a leak that was going to happen, because the morning before he got arrested, pretty much every media organisation was waiting outside his house. And I know because I was there. And I know you've been accused in court of leaking that information.
And you heard me give evidence under oath?
No, because no one asked you about that. Did you get...
I got asked questions about that,
And what did you say?
I said it wasn't released by me, and I'm confident that it wasn't people under me.
In that case, it's come up in two different court matters, because I was thinking of another one where this was talked about and was basically said that you leaked that. I know that I got that from another journalist. And it was kind of chatter. Bill Spedding's going to get arrested on such and such a date. You might want to be there. And I remember calling you up again and trying to get you to confirm it, and you wouldn't. And I was really frustrated that you wouldn't, because I basically had to go to my editor and say, I think this is happening. We should definitely pay for the flight to get me there. But all I can substantiate that with is that another journo told me. Turns out it was right. So someone was leaking.
So someone was leaking. But what that Bill Spedding situation, the arrest there, think for the 4 years that I ran the investigation, it wasn't names being thrown out. This person's a suspect.
No.
And I think since you've done a deep dive into the investigation, you'd get a sense of how many people we were looking at during that 4-year period.
Yeah.
That never, ever came out.
Yeah, other names that didn't come out
Yeah.
at that point, that's true. And the other thing I should say is Bill Spedding was arrested for unrelated offences, which he was subsequently found not guilty of.
Yeah.
Bill Spedding has never been charged in relation to William Tyrrell's disappearance. No evidence has ever come to light that he was in any way involved in or had any knowledge of William's disappearance. He's always protested his innocence. He has said he's got an alibi, that he was at the school watching one of his kids get an award. There's evidence to support that alibi. He's known to have made a payment in the cafe across the road. There is frankly nothing that I have seen that the police have come forward with to suggest he was involved at all. And this is the point where we might fall out. That was an investigation that you oversaw, and it was subsequently described as the worst case of malicious prosecution in the state.
Yeah, and I think I've had the conversation with you. That hit me harder than when I was criminally charged, like saying a malicious prosecution.
Yeah.
I've said my evidence at court. I'm not sure how far I can push what I want to say about that, but the way that position was defended, I, in my humble opinion, think it could have been defended in a different way. And again, and people are probably sick of hearing me say this, I stand by what I did on the investigation, and I invite proper scrutiny. Not courts can only make decisions based on the information that's provided to them. And probably enough said. Moved on from that, but. I'm not trying to make a point. I want to talk about your podcast. But again, I think what our conversation just said, it reflects so many people have got opinions. There's misinformation floating around. And what I sincerely hope, and this is why I keep putting my hand up and say, let's have a parliamentary inquiry. Let's have a public inquiry, because I'm sick of the misinformation. Not just impacting on me, impacting on other people, more importantly, William's foster parents and biological parents, the misinformation going around. So I'm hoping that your podcast will shine a light on it. You said you've been working on it for 2 years. Give us a sense of the magnitude of what you do, because I've seen how you work, and I've got to say this, Dan, you would have made a good homicide detective.
That's very kind, but I don't know. That's a hard job. Anyway, that's a side issue. Homicide detectives work hard. But this, I've never done anything like this. I mean, I've worked hard on other cases before for podcasts and books, but the scale of this is unlike anything else. So we have got, all right, just to give you an idea, just the sheer number of documents, and it is literally folders and folders and folders full of documents, and dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews. And to give you an idea of just how much information we're trying to process, one of the things I really like to do with these long investigations is just build up a timeline.
Yeah.
Just bullet points, this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened, and put a footnote at the end of each bullet point saying this is the source of that fact. And it's always got to be a primary source. It's not a newspaper article or another report. It's a witness statement. It's a court transcript or an interview we've done. So just that timeline, that list of bullet points, is currently at something over 160,000 words. So that's the length of 2 entire books, and that's our starting point. From there you can follow the footnotes to each of those documents or to the interview we've done. And it's massive and it's overwhelming. And that's also probably part of the reason I'm so tired right at the moment, because we are working through that. But that is kind of like the keystone in what we do. From everything there, we can write those episodes, we can write those news stories, because we know we've got our facts as best we can laid out in order. But yeah, I and the people I'm working with, and there's several of us working on this, I've never worked on anything as big or as complicated as this.
And I think the nature of this investigation, this is I've organised crime investigations. There can be a lot of different pathways, different layers to that. This is complex in that the starting point, with William's disappearance. No forensic evidence, no eyewitness.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, actually, this shouldn't be that complicated.
No.
It's not an organised crime. It's not a financial crime, which is, huge amounts of financial reports and data. This was one child going missing. It shouldn't be that complicated to what it's become now. And a big part of that goes back to what you just said. There's no forensic evidence. And part of the reason there's no forensic evidence is when William went missing, it was treated as a little boy lost. The police were on the scene within minutes, hugely impressive response. And they called in other officers. They called in mounted police, cops on trail bikes. They called in the SES. They had a helicopter up. They called in divers. Hundreds and hundreds of people just volunteered their time to look for William. And that's all incredible. But the one thing that wasn't done was a crime scene established. So I've spoken to people who were there that day, and they talk about people just walking over the lawn, in and out of the house where William went missing, cars being allowed to drive up and down the road with no one checking who was in them or where they were going or taking note of the rego plates. And as a result, that moment when there would have been some forensic evidence, if there was going to be any, and let's be honest, there usually is, all of that was lost. It either wasn't collected or it was literally trampled into the dirt beneath the feet of the well-meaning people who were looking for William because they thought he'd walked off.
I'm sitting there listening, and I'm agreeing with everything you're saying, and I've been asked questions in the past about that, and the primary focus was on looking for the little boy lost, which in 99.9% of the time, they find the child in those circumstances. It's dead easy for me being the journalist because I get to just say, well, that was done wrong. I don't have to be the person on the scene, the inspector who's coordinating that massive response and is responsible for it. I don't have to be that person. So it's really easy for me to criticise, but it was done with the best will in the world, fine. It was done under incredible pressure, and everyone's concentrating on finding a missing boy. But the fact remains, there's no forensic evidence, and that meant the investigation was struggling from the start. It made it harder, and I can obviously speak of that from my homicide experience. I made recommendations in accountable documents, progress reports, and different things that we've got to look at the SOPs for that type of situation.
Standing operating procedures.
And I was making this as strong as I could in the recommendations that when a situation presents itself like that, concurrently, running independent of the search operation, there should be a criminal investigation. And it might be after the first hour, if the child hasn't been found, detectives should be called out and they start running a criminal investigation.
Well, you are right on that. On this one, I think there were local detectives on the scene looking at the investigation within about 4 hours.
Yeah.
So going through the police records, they were there. But still, the focus is on, has William wandered off?
Yeah.
And strangely, that seemed to still be the focus for weeks, or at least there was confusion over what the focus is, because the case is given to the homicide squad about a week after William goes missing. But after that, you've got the local police commander is still doing all the media interviews and is still saying, and I was checking this morning, he's still saying, well, it might be a kid who's wandered off, or it might be human intervention. We don't know. And so you've got these mixed messages, like who's in charge? Is it the local police? Is it the homicide squad? What really is the focus in this investigation? It doesn't have that kind of laser-like focus on this could be a homicide. We need to gather all the information and shut this down and control the public perception of this. So it felt like there was a lot of confusion.
Dan, look, in sitting down with you today, I want to give people an understanding of what's going to be presented with the podcast series that you've done. But you've touched on things, and I can't help but offer an opinion. I've been sitting on the sidelines for a long time, and I think it's been 10 years since William disappeared, or over 10 years now. when I took over the investigation 5 months after, the very thing that you talked about there, I identified as a problem. And that's where I made a conscious decision saying, hey, homicide is running this investigation. I'm running this investigation. That wasn't to stroke my ego. That was to get control of an investigation that was, the wrong messaging was going out. We needed to get that laser focus, as you said. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And put the pressure on the person or persons that might have knowledge or involvement of William's disappearance.
I guess that's the reason for it, isn't it? Because I remember being a reporter and covering the case at the time, and we didn't know who was in charge. Like, was it homicide? Was it the local police? Who were they looking at? And if you've got the local police commander bluntly saying, we don't know what happened, it could be this, it could be that, then whoever is responsible isn't feeling the pressure. They're feeling like they might have got away with it. And that changes what they do, and it changes what the people around them who might know something do. And that's when I talk about messaging. I don't, I'm not talking about PR here. I'm talking about, was there an opportunity missed to put that pressure on, to basically use the media to speak to that person or the people who know them and say, we're coming for you. We're going to get you, just in case they slip up.
Well, Dan, and I again, I'm not sure if it comes out in your podcast, but I got a certain amount of criticism for going at it aggressively with the media when I said anyone within a square kilometre that hasn't come forward, I'm wondering why you haven't come forward and we're going to be looking at you. I got a lot of complaints about that. The members of the public going, how dare you accuse us of this? But that was done for a reason. That was an aggressive strategy to flush people out and put pressure on.
Yeah, and look, again, it's really easy for me to criticise things that aren't done, and it's easy for you to sit here and say I think there should be a public inquiry, and it's possible that we're wrong, and that the current police who've been working on it for the past 5 and a bit years have identified the right suspect and have gathered all of the evidence they need and are any moment about to crack this case wide open. And that will prove them right and us wrong. But if they've done that, then why haven't they done it yet? Why haven't they charged someone? Why haven't they made public what they know by going to a court and saying, this is the evidence we've got? Why are they still sitting on it? You've got an inquest. It's all going to come to a head in the next couple of months. The inquest has got a hearing in November and a hearing in December, and I don't see how those hearings can happen without the police having to basically say, this is what we've been doing, this is the evidence we've got. And if we do get to the end of that, and we still don't know what happened to William, a decade on, and we do know that several lives, we talked about Bill Spedding, several lives have been damaged by the police investigation, then yeah, I'm with you. I think if we get to that point, there does need to be a public inquiry and some kind of public reckoning.
Well, an inquest, in effect, is a public inquiry.
But it's not looking at the police investigation.
That's true. That's true.
The coroner has specifically said, I'm not looking at the police investigation.
That is true. But I'm hoping answers information that comes out. So with the investigation that you've done and the work that you've done on the podcast, are you surprised by some of the things that you've come across?
Yeah, I really have been. I knew the case because I worked on it at the time and probably for a few years. And then when we were co-writing your books, a big part of those was the William Tyrrell investigation because it was the case that did lead essentially to the end of your career in the police. Yeah. So we had to include it. And then again, because you got publicly criticised by Mick Fuller, the then police commissioner, who said that the investigation had been a mess. We had to change the way we wrote one of those books because we weren't planning on writing the second one and mentioning the William Tyrrell case at all. And then he came out and publicly criticises you. And it felt strange not to be including that. Yeah. If you're now publicly identified with getting this case wrong and you put out a book and pretend that hasn't been said, So we changed that book and we put the William Tyrrell case back in. So I've been reporting on this case in different ways for a long time over the past decade. And even then, the stuff we've heard in the last 2 years has surprised me.
Yeah.
And it's not been a good series of surprises. Like, I haven't been surprised by how well everything's been doing. But like, the one that stands out is what I've learned about how the Unsolved Homicide team work. Because when I used to be a crime reporter, I had a huge amount of respect for New South Wales Police. Probably too much. And probably a bit of that was because I did get stories from them. And I thought the Unsolved Homicide team was part of the homicide squad and they did a great job catching the bad guys. And then working on this, I've learned more about how the Unsolved Homicide team works. And some of this was made public. In fact, a lot of it was made public by a Special Commission of Inquiry last year. We're talking about missing evidence. Not just bits of evidence, but pallet loads of evidence that the police didn't know they had. We're talking about cases that have gone for decades because bits of paper were left in a pocket and had never been noticed by police. We're talking about DNA tests that weren't done, even after the technology became available. They've got a backlog of cases that they haven't looked at. It's about 400 cases. Haven't ever even looked at them. And yeah, they're working on all of those things and you know, they're trying to get it better now since that inquiry. But the one that really sticks out is the detective who's now leading the investigation to William Tyrrell's disappearance, David Laidlaw, is from the Unsolved Homicide team. He's one of the most senior people in that team. He's the investigations coordinator. He has had 19 files of unsolved homicides sitting on his desk for a year, which he hasn't opened. And these are files that other detectives have gone through and said, oh, I think you should have a look at this. And it goes to him to decide whether they take it to the next step and maybe reinvestigate it. 19 files sitting on his desk, gathering dust, which he hasn't opened for a year. So that's 19 families who don't know what happened to their loved one. And he was asked in the Special Commission of Inquiry, why? Why have you not opened them? And he said, well, I was busy, mostly with the William Tyrrell investigation. And they said to him, well, did you tell anyone about that? And he said, no. He said, did you ask for any other resources to work on that? And he said, no. And they said, why not? And he said, I don't know. That shocked me. That I get he's busy. I get he's working on the William Tyrrell investigation. But in the past few years, I've seen him sitting in court for fairly minor matters as part of this investigation, day after day after day after day. I think 13 days, I counted them. So he's had all those files sitting on his desk, and he's chosen not to open them because he's looking elsewhere, and he's not asked for any help to open them. And that did shock me. I can't imagine what those 19 families who've sat there not knowing that no one was looking at their loved one's case. I can't imagine what they felt.
It's cruel, really. It's and I can speak with confidence with dealing with victims' families in homicides that type of thing is soul destroying. They suffer from losing their loved one, and then suffer if it's not being followed up properly. And it's a difficult world to work in, but I suppose the relevance of that, and this is I'm looking from the outside, the relevance of the inefficiencies or what was happening with unsolved homicide. William's foster mother, when she gave evidence at my court matter, when I was charged, convicted, appealed, still convicted. So I put that out there, and people have heard the story enough. She gave evidence, and part of her concern was if I was taken off the investigation, the matter was going to be referred to unsolved homicide. And you're looking at unsolved homicide because, well, are they legitimate concerns, or is it good that it went there?
Well, that's it. I was in court when she said that, and I can remember hearing her say it. She had this fear that William's case would be sent to unsolved homicide, and from memory, I think she was told it was going to be by a senior officer. And at that point, I remember thinking, oh yeah, but the Unsolved Homicide team are pretty good, because I still thought that.
Yeah.
You know, I thought the Homicide Squad were great. I thought the Unsolved Homicide team were part of that, and they were great too. And in fairness, I have met one or two Unsolved Homicide detectives subsequently who've been great. And so I thought maybe her fears were a bit overblown. But then what I've learned in the past 2 years working on this investigation, her fears were completely accurate. Missing evidence, cases you've never reviewed, cases that will take years and years and years for them to even open the file. William's foster mother was right to be frightened that a case ends up there. And that is shocking.
I think you look at now, where 5.5 years since I've been taken off, or almost 6 years since I've been taken off. Part of my battle when I was running the investigation was that they wanted to shut it down and get it to unsolved homicide. And now I look and, well, there's been supposedly 5.5 years more work to do on an investigation they wanted to shut down when I was running it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. One thing the cops have said to us, because we wrote about these 19 cases gathering dust.
Yeah.
The one thing the cops did say was, they said, we're not going to talk about William Tyrrell, other than to say William Tyrrell's case has never been formally referred to the Unsolved Homicide team. And so I wrote back and I said, that is true, but the guy running William Tyrrell's investigation is in the Unsolved Homicide team, and so are some of the other people on the William Tyrrell strike force. And they said, yes, that's true. So it's not formally an Unsolved Homicide, but it is Unsolved Homicide detectives who are working it.
Yeah. These are the layers of the William Tyrrell investigation. I haven't finished with you, Dan, but
Okay.
we'll have a break, and
Okay.
then when we get back, I just want to get more of a sense of the podcast, what people are to expect, and hopefully shed some light on. I think it's fair to say this is one of the country's biggest mysteries, isn't it?
I think it's the biggest case that I've covered, and I think it's the most high-profile case in the country in the last 10 years, nothing has come close.
No, it's and I look at it. Everyone can identify with William and the circumstances of disappearing at your grandparents' place, playing in a safe space. So, okay, we'll take a break and we'll get back shortly.